All right, so we'll talk about the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the end of the sort of three-world or three-part tripartite conception of the world: First World, Second World, Third World, and thus the entry into a post-Cold War world. And depending on how much time we have, we'll look at briefly as sort of an America ascendant in this new world order, but also look at some new challenges to American, that American ascendancy, both, I guess you'd say, geopolitically and also economically. But first, the collapse of the Soviet Union. As we get into the 1980s, it's been 40 plus years of the Cold War. 40 years of two superpowers in the world vying for influence, challenging one another in these variety of ways. Of course, there was the wild card of China that we talked about last time, but still, no one would doubt that the two superpowers above all others were America and the Soviet Union. How the hell is it that one of them simply implodes upon itself? I mean, it was nothing directly that America did. Certainly America didn't invade the Soviet Union. There was no World War III. So how is it that by the early 1990s, the Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore? There are different theories. One was that the arms race with the United States ultimately sort of bankrupted the Soviet Union, that it could not compete with America on that scale. Another element to probably most of the theories as to why this happened, and of course there can't be any one, well, for most people there's not any one singular explanation, but another key element would be the war in Afghanistan that I described as kind of the Soviet Union's Vietnam, as Vietnam was for America in the 1980s, both in terms of how much money it costs and how it causes the Soviet Union to lose sort of prestige or standing in the world, that the mighty Soviet Union can't exert its will over tiny little backwards Afghanistan. The crumbling of the Eastern Bloc is a key component to the Soviet Union's own collapse. The deterioration of the economies and therefore the viability of the governments of the satellite states of the Eastern Bloc, those communist puppet regimes from East Germany down to Romania. The rise to power of the moderate Mikhail Gorbachev to the leadership of the Communist Party and therefore of the Soviet Union as a factor. And finally, and probably most importantly, simply the failure of state socialism. The failure in both internally in Russia and in the global sense of the state-run economy. It had become evident in the nations of the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union itself that these various five-year plans, and it had been decades, number of regime changes after Stalin, so it wasn't just a failure of Stalinism. You've gone through Khrushchev, a moderate, and Brezhnev and various others in the 70s, and you come to Gorbachev, and it's left to him to try something, by Soviet standards, radically different, to try to save state socialism, try to save the Communist Party. And when Gorbachev comes to power in the 1980s, he institutes two radical reform plans, perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika means restructuring. In this case, to mean the restructuring of the Soviet economy. Do you remember what China did under Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai in the 70s? They basically, they scrapped the idea of state socialism when it came to certain markets, like consumer goods. They allowed for investment in China and private investment, private ownership. They invested in the capitalist world. They more or less integrated the Chinese economy with the capitalist world, and all they did is allow the government, the state, the party, to maintain control over key industries in the state enterprise system. Remember? Like steel and oil and nuclear energy. Russia didn't do that. This is what Gorbachev tries to do with perestroika. Essentially to emulate, to a certain extent, the Chinese model by maintaining control of certain big key industries and opening others like consumer goods up to capitalist elements, controls, and private ownership, profit incentive, outside investment. In other words, not direct state control. At the same time, Gorbachev also attempts to do what the Chinese Communist Party did not do, which is relax its suppression of dissent. Glasnost means openness, as in openness in the political system. To gravitate towards some semblance of the kind of individual freedoms associated with the liberal democracies of the West. Freedom of the press. Backing off of being a police state and freeing people held as political prisoners. Allowing for criticism of the government, freedom of speech. Relax your control of Soviet culture and allow artists of various types to express themselves as they see fit. So, had these kinds of reforms been instituted a decade or more prior, maybe things would have gone differently. In this case, though, it appears it was too little too late. And ironically, these reforms actually served to accelerate the collapse of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union rather than save them. Simultaneously, the regimes, the puppet regimes in the Eastern Bloc are failing one by one. Resistance movements had always existed. From the time these communist regimes, these oppressive regimes are put in place in East Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, there was resistance. But what would happen in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s if there was a resistance that became an actual threat to the government? The Soviet Red Army rolled in and crushed the uprising. Also, if these countries are having economic problems, and they all were, continually to keep those governments in power, the Soviet Union was bailing them out. And that's another thing that contributes to the downfall of the Soviet Union, constantly having to bail out these satellite states in the Eastern Bloc. And here's the key. Gorbachev stops both. He refuses to continue bailing these regimes out economically, and when we see a couple of key instances of mass uprisings against communist rule, Gorbachev refuses to send in the Red Army. The inevitable consequence of those decisions was the failure of these puppet regimes, one by one by one. As you look at the numbers, 1989, 1990, in the span of 2 years, all the Eastern Bloc puppet regimes have been overthrown. This is the Polish Solidarity leader, Lech Wałęsa. The most dramatic moment in all this, and what comes to symbolize the failure of Soviet-style communism in general, is the fall of the Berlin Wall. There's a mass protest emerges in the streets of Berlin, and people demanding that the East German government open the gates in the Berlin Wall. You remember they shut in West Berlin because it's a little outpost of the West. And people demanded that the gates be open, and by the thousands, the hundreds of thousands. And without Soviet help, the East German government attempts to handle this matter itself. More or less, it would ultimately, push come to shove, it would have to be East German troops on the wall that would have to open fire on their own citizens, and they refused to do that, instead standing in solidarity with the protesters. And it becomes an existential threat to the regime. The leader, Erich Honecker, steps down, moderates take his place. They open up the wall, it's jubilation. People spontaneously begin chipping away at the wall, and all this is caught on camera. And you have not just the opening of the gates and people pouring from west to east of the city and vice versa in jubilation, but also literally the tearing down of the wall, which boosts the sort of legend of Ronald Reagan in America, because he had not, he had very recently sort of demanded rhetorically of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Well, he didn't do it directly, but maybe he had a hand in it in the way that we discussed, that the East German and West German people do indeed tear down large portions of the wall. And eventually, you will see the reunification of Germany under one single capitalist, liberal democratic regime that's still in power in Germany today. And the same thing happens in the other Eastern Bloc countries. And then what we see is the dissolution of the USSR itself, of the Soviet Union. You remember what USSR stands for? CCCP in the Cyrillic, but Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So it's like the United States in that there are multiple states, if you will, or in this case, socialist republics, of which Russia was only one. Of course, it was by far the largest one in terms of land and population. But the Soviet Union also consisted of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Belarus, or White Russia, the Ukraine, Moldova down here, Stalin's home of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then the stands in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, according to Borat, asshole Uzbekistan. You guys seen a new Borat film?
No.
Striking out. The character's from Kazakhstan. He hates the Uzbekistani people. Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan. Anyway, these various socialist republics move in the early 90s to obtain their independence and sever themselves from the Communist Party and the Soviet Union. And gradually, with essentially the acquiescence of Gorbachev, they do become independent nations. I should say, though, that during this time, it's not so simple as Gorbachev is in 100% control of really anything. It's a chaotic situation that sees Gorbachev nearly overthrown in a coup. He kind of wanders off and hides at his dacha in the countryside for a little while. And then sort of fades into obscurity and kind of emerges later as a guy who would come to the West and speak about these experiences of the current state of the world. I actually got to see him speak at Auburn one time, but regrettably, they had him in the damn basketball arena, which at the time was a shithole, and couldn't understand anything he said, particularly because of the volume they had the translator at versus his volume. It was terrible. I couldn't understand a word he said. I'm sure it was a great speech. Any case, by 1991, by the end of the year 1991, the Soviet Union has essentially dissolved. Russia is simply now the Russian Federation. These various other socialist republics are independent states, many of them dictatorships. A couple of them remain under the control of authoritarian regimes, I guess in the West, most notably Belarus, but also some of these Central Asian nations are authoritarian regimes. The leader of Russia initially is the man standing on a tank there at top left outside the Parliament building in Moscow. That is Boris Yeltsin, charismatic fellow, a man who is bad to drink, appeared drunk on television a number of times. Guy enjoyed his vodka. But he was a pragmatic leader and earnestly sought to reorient Russia towards the West as a capitalist liberal democracy. But when you have a situation in which you transition rapidly from state socialism and one-party rule and what was probably closer to an oligarchy and the rule and wealth of the very few to genuine liberal democratic capitalism, you have a situation rife for corruption if there is no one who's truly in control. And I don't know that Boris Yeltsin was ever truly in control. There is widespread corruption in the 1990s, general malfeasance, I guess you could say, economic stagnation. It doesn't help that a lot of the Russian government's revenue comes from oil sales, and there was a terrible downturn in the oil market at the time. And so Yeltsin doesn't last long before giving way to that man whom you all know, who has been in power ever since, Vladimir Putin. He has held different positions over the last, I guess, nearly a quarter of a century now. But whether he's president or prime minister and his buddy Medvedev is the other, when he's the other, it doesn't matter. He's been the guy who's been in control ever since Yeltsin. And he's able to assert more or less total control in the figure of himself, though he is technically, supposedly democratically elected. You could argue about the validity of those elections, but he actually does remain popular with a lot of Russians because you had the once mighty Soviet Union in a period of 10 years become, and in particular if you look at Yeltsin drunk on TV, like the laughing stock of the world. And consider this too, you have literally generations of people who had known nothing but Communist Party rule, people who had never lived under any regime other than communism, who knew nothing of liberal democratic freedoms or that kind of society, but they had known the previous greatness of the Soviet Union. So if a guy came along who said, why don't we table this democracy stuff, reassert total control, and I'll build this back up economically and geopolitically. And that's what he does. He rescues Russia's economy. He brings back Russia as perhaps not quite a superpower, but close. And I think maybe you could make a case. It's no longer binary like it was for a lot of the Cold War. But in the process, though, he essentially established himself as a dictator and returns Russia to the kind of state where you can't really push too hard back against the regime, or you find yourself dead, assassinated in some foreign country, or disappeared off in a prison somewhere, or who knows what. In other words, they rolled back those democratic freedoms, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and committed themselves to building Russia back up economically and geopolitically. And to a certain extent, Putin has done that. In the last 10, 15 years, he has also strategically made some aggressive moves, like extending Russian control down here in the Caucasus around the Black Sea, supporting a uprising in the Ukraine and so on, just to sort of test and see, like, what will America, what will the West do? How much can I get away with? Let's back up just a little bit, though. When the Soviet Union collapses there, you have a period where, as I mentioned earlier, America is sort of ascendant as the lone superpower of the world. And so it's freer than ever to pursue its interests in the world, and can do so certainly without wondering, what will the Russians do? And China had not reached the point yet where you were all that worried, what would China do? Certainly, at least not in the Middle East. And in 1991, America goes to war in the Middle East, the first Iraq War, the first Persian Gulf War, as it's sometimes called, when the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, invaded the tiny nation of Kuwait. Iraq is here, Kuwait is here. It's very small, but it's very rich. Obviously, a lot of oil down there makes some people very, very wealthy, and some of those people are friendly with America, as is the leadership of Kuwait, as is the leadership of this incredibly wealthy nation of Saudi Arabia. I think, given what we know transpired between this year, this moment that we're looking at here in present day, it's ironic that the American ally, both then and now, is Saudi Arabia, and that is a theocracy, a fundamentalist Muslim theocracy, Saudi Arabia. Saddam Hussein was a secular leader. He was a dictator, and he did some terrible shit to his own people, including gassing people in the north, the Kurdish minority that lives in the north of Iraq, towards where Turkey is. But, America was friends with a lot of dictators. But it just so happens that our interests had aligned over the years with the Saudis. And so when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, it's not only a threat to destabilize the region, to fuck up the oil markets, but it's also a strategic threat to your ally, the Saudis. And so America takes the lead in a coalition of nations under the auspices of I'm trying to remember, this is a NATO operation, actually. I don't want to say that and then be wrong. Certainly it's a coalition of nations, the United States, Britain, and others, who will drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait. The U.S. also invades Iraq from the Saudi desert in the north or the southwest of Iraq. Overwhelming military superiority. The United States is at the doorstep of Baghdad in a matter of weeks. Saddam Hussein had a formidable army if he was going toe-to-toe with, say, Iran. And Iraq and Iran had fought off and on for many years prior to that time. But when faced with the overwhelming technological superiority of the United States, there was no match. The U.S., which was at the time led by George Herbert Walker Bush, the first George Bush, decided that at that time they would not push on into Baghdad and topple Saddam Hussein and engage in regime change. Figuring they had achieved the goal of driving Iraq out of Kuwait, protecting Saudi interests and integrity, and putting sort of Saddam Hussein in his place. Sort of mission accomplished. You have these iconic scenes, though, as the retreating army, Iraqi army set the oil fields afire. Now, one of the problems here is that the very presence of American troops on the soil of the Middle East, in the heart of the Muslim world, only served to exacerbate a growing movement of Muslim religious fanaticism among a lot of people. And the rise of radical Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. We talked about the ironies of American assistance to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan already during the latter stages of the Cold War. So keep that in mind. To understand that first of all, let me say there are a billion Muslims in the world, and 99.9% of them are not terrorists. We're talking about a very small percentage of followers of the Islamic faith. But we need to sort of go layer by layer here and understand how do we get to that, less than 1%. For some people that end up becoming terrorists or parts of terrorist organization, carrying out acts of terror, or that is acts of violence in order to intimidate people, to support your position, back off of a certain position, get the hell out of your part of the world, or whatever it may be. For some people, the motivations could be political, in other words, anti-imperialist. Understanding not even that, I was going to say a long view of the world or your part of the world, but not so long. Think about when they dismantled the Ottoman Empire and carved up the Middle East into mandates, which are essentially colonies of Britain and France. Arbitrarily drawing borderlines and creating those nations of Iraq and Syria and Jordan, Palestine. Therefore, feeling like your part of the world, which, by the way, that part of the world is the Holy Land for not one, not two, but 3 different religions, right? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That's the Holy Land, all 3. But you feel like it had for centuries been part of an Arab Muslim empire, be it the Ottomans or the Umayyads or the Abbasids. And then it's invaded and overtaken by the West, imperialized. And you want these Westerners out of your part of the world. The same, if you're looking at Afghanistan over to the east, you could have the same posture. It would just be towards the Soviets. Well, how about after World War II, back over in the Middle East? Of course, Jewish people had been subjected to genocide during World War II at the hands of the Nazis. And once the full horrors of the Holocaust came to be understood in the years after the war, there was an increase in support for Zionism. The creation of a Jewish nation state in the Holy Land and the repopulation of Jewish people to that nation state. Israel is created after World War II as that nation state for the Jewish people in the Holy Land. The problem is, at that time, that was the mandate of Palestine, populated mostly by Arabs who are Muslim, in land that they feel like is Holy Land to them. So they see the Israelis as outside invaders and occupiers of their Holy Land, while the Jewish people argue that their people were there first. Christianity came after Judaism and Islam came after Christianity. So in their minds, it's originally the Abrahamic Jewish homeland. But that probably is the number one political motivator for a lot of these people, just the mere existence of the state of Israel. And the fact that the United States and Britain and France and others back the state of Israel and give it not only legitimacy, but the full weight of their power so that it may continue to exist. Of course, the state of Israel feels like it is surrounded on all sides by hostile nations and people who would eradicate it, and that it needs that kind of support in order to survive. That being said, for some people, and probably with all of these individuals that we're eventually talking about, there's a mixture of religious and political motivations, but the weight could be different on one side or the other. For some, it may be more religious before it is political. And in this regard, we have to go I talked about peeling away the layers. We got to peel away several more layers to go from just people who are Muslim to people who are Islamist to followers of movements like the Salafist movement to followers of things like Wahhabism. First things first, what is an Islamist? An Islamist is somebody who believes in theocracy, ruled by religion. They feel like politics and governance should be guided by the principles of the Muslim faith. So if you're an Islamist, that doesn't mean you're a terrorist. The vast majority of Islamists are not terrorists and don't support terrorism. They support rule by the Muslim faith, and that can take different shapes and colors depending on where you are and when you are. But all that means is for you, religion and governance or government are connected, intimately so. Now, let's go a layer further. Some Islamists are followers of movements like the Salafist movement, who you could call fundamentalists. They believe in literal interpretations of the holy book of Islam, the Quran, the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. They are what they are. They say what they say. There's no, shifting or changing them around to interpret them differently in the modern world. You could have fundamentalists like this in any religion. There are Christian fundamentalists. There are Jewish fundamentalists. So the Salafist movement is a Muslim fundamentalist movement. Some Salafists believe in strict enforcement of Sharia law. Socio-religious law, you might say, as set out in the Quran, regulating people's behavior, dictating oftentimes very strict punishments for certain crimes. And even though I say, if you're a Salafist, you're a fundamentalist, you believe in literal interpretations of the Quran, sometimes this means literal interpretations that maybe are not so obvious to some people, but are interpreted another way and have been for many, many years by some others. Like, for example, when Muhammad says women in the presence of men should be behind the veil, what does that mean? For some, that might mean literally all women anywhere in public have to be covered head to toe in the burqa as such, right? Nothing but the eyes showing, and sometimes even with a veil over the eyes. So you can see some of these interpretations are going to be pretty oppressive to us in the West. Of women, of minorities, of, as we'll see, many others. But again, in terms of interpretation, this could simply mean, are you wearing just the hijab, which some women will wear, of their own accord and as a cultural statement, perhaps even to some extent a fashion statement. But that's one thing. But in other parts of the Muslim world, women may be forced into this kind of public appearance. It could mean something as simple as, public caning for a minor offense. As we will see, though, it could be much more extreme and even incredibly brutal. Depending on to what extent you thought you should take every word of the Quran literal when it comes to Sharia law, a strict adherence to Sharia law could be incredibly oppressive and brutal, particularly if you follow a movement like Wahhabism that regards not just followers of other religions and not just Shiite Muslims, but certainly Shiite Muslims, as in not Sunni Muslims. This is a Sunni movement, as is Salafism. But even other Sunnis who are not followers of Wahhabism, they're considered apostates or enemies of the faith. And for some Wahhabis, you might think it fitting to eliminate enemies of the faith. The characteristic here, the key characteristic of a movement like Wahhabism is a deep intolerance for any kind of difference and a strict fundamentalism, including a strict adherence to even the more brutal elements of Sharia law. Now let's pivot back over to Afghanistan. Recall that when the Soviet Union withdraws from Afghanistan, it falls into civil war with several groups vying for power and control, one of which were members of the Mujahideen that had been armed and trained by the American CIA to fight against the Russians, who, after the Russians leave, find themselves under the leadership of Mullah Omar. Figure sans eye there at top center. They become the Taliban. And they win that civil war. And they become the rulers of Afghanistan throughout the 1990s. The Muslim faith that they follow is essentially Wahhabism of a different name. Fundamentalist, backward-looking, deeply intolerant, and with a brutal institution of Sharia law that terrorizes the Afghan people. Oppression of women, any minorities or outsiders, any who don't follow their strict version of the faith, violent punishments, beheadings for certain kind of crimes, stoning adulterous women to death, cutting off people's hands for stealing, this kind of thing. What's more, they more or less opened the doors of Afghanistan to a Saudi exile of a very wealthy family, whose family had ties with the United States, but he himself is a strict follower of Wahhabism and, above all else, carries a deep hatred for the West and the United States, for Western culture, for imperialism, for American meddling in the Muslim world, the support for the state of Israel, and so on. So, more than anyone, Osama bin Laden brings together those political and religious elements or motivations that we were talking about earlier. And while he is not welcome in his own country, he has a lot of money that he can take with him to Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, where he will build what he calls the base, or Al-Qaeda. A terrorist organization based in Afghanistan whose number one goal is attacking the United States, inflicting death and destruction on America and its interests in the world. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it is easy to view what happens in the 1990s as a steady buildup to what happens in 2001, but I can tell you, having lived through that time, for most Americans it did not seem that way at the time. But in the early 1990s, Al-Qaeda bombed the World Trade Center the first time, setting off car bombs in the parking garages beneath the Twin Towers that killed a number of people, but certainly did not bring the buildings down or cause, the deaths of thousands of people or anything like we would later see. Ought to have been a wake-up call, and for the American intelligence community, I think it was. If it wasn't, there are subsequent attacks on American military bases in Saudi Arabia. Literally within the last couple of weeks, the mastermind of two attacks in the mid-90s was killed just a couple of weeks ago. The man who masterminded attacks on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in East Africa, killing hundreds of people. There's an attack on an American warship in the Middle East, the USS Cole. They basically rammed a speedboat with explosives on it in the side of a U.S. warship, killing a number of American sailors. And then there is, of course, September 11th. 9/11, Al-Qaeda operatives, most of them from Saudi Arabia, in fact, hijacked 4 commercial airliners. They've been training for months on how to fly big jet airliners. they used box cutters to overtake the flight crews and the pilots and commandeer control of the planes, two of which flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in Manhattan, instantly killing a lot of people, and then as the jet fuel burned into the steel foundations of the buildings, collapsing both towers and killing a lot more people, including a ton of firefighters, first responders who were there trying to save people, and destroying a massive chunk of southern Manhattan in the process. All of which played out on television while I and other people watched, horrified. You initially thought when the first one got hit and you turn on the TV, oh God, surely it was some terrible, tragic mistake. But a lot of people, I did not see this occur live, but a lot of people did, were watching the TV when the second plane flew into the second tower. And then you instantly know this is not an accident. And then another plane hits the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., head of the American military, Department of Defense, killing hundreds of people. There's a massive hole in that massive building. And then there's the fourth plane that nobody knows where the hell it's going. People thought it was going to the White House, the U.S. Capitol, who knows? The crew of that flight, or not the crew, the passengers of that flight, actually attempted to overtake the terrorist hijackers, and the guy flying the plane, rather than face the disgrace of that, just flies the plane into the ground in Pennsylvania, killing everybody on board. So the result is the deaths of nearly 3,000 people, the clear awakening of the world to the scale of this threat, and the declaration by the Bush administration of a war on terror. What does that mean, a war on terror? A war like any other up to that point, certainly. Wars to that point were fought between nation states or within them, between nations and revolutionaries. How do you fight a war against an ideology? How does that manifest? Well, the first clear and sort of obvious answer to everyone was to go after the Taliban. They allowed bin Laden in, allowed him safe haven to plot these attacks. So the two obvious answers were take out the Taliban and kill bin Laden. One of those things proved pretty easy to do, at least in terms of dislodging the Taliban from government and installing a government that was friendly to you in Afghanistan. But there's an asterisk on that because we're still fighting the Taliban. Afghanistan overtakes Vietnam for America's longest war. The Taliban have still not been eradicated in Afghanistan. We have a friendly government regime over there that is allies with America that controls most of Afghanistan, but not all of it. The U.S. does successfully disrupt al-Qaeda operations, although al-Qaeda still exists, not just in Afghanistan and other parts of the world. Not until the Obama administration will we finally find Osama bin Laden and he is killed. But the most controversial aspect, or what you might say where the war on terror fell short, is the decision in 2003 to invade Iraq again under the George W. Bush administration, under the reasoning that supposedly Saddam Hussein had, quote, weapons of mass destruction. What if the Saddam Hussein regime has nuclear weapons? What if they have mass chemical weapons that they could unleash on Israel or on other of America's allies? What if Saddam Hussein is, somehow playing nice with al-Qaeda? Which I think a lot of people knew at the time, and certainly a lot of people know now, was not only not true, but, kind of ridiculous. Remember, Saddam Hussein's regime is a secular regime. It's not a Wahhabist. He doesn't care about any of that. He cares about oil money and control and power. And he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. It simply was not true. Now, you could debate whether or not I think a lot of people genuinely believe that he did. There was intelligence that suggested maybe. And though now I think he regrets it deeply, the American General Colin Powell went before the United Nations and showed these photographs of installations that we thought were showing, these are the weapons, these are where the weapons of mass destruction are. Turns out it's not what they were. But that was used as the rationale to invade Iraq again, and this time to go into Baghdad, to remove Saddam Hussein from power and to initiate a regime change and put in place a government that was some semblance of a liberal democratic government. All of which the U.S. does with the help of the British and a few others. And then the United States learns the hard way that, one of the things, you can talk about the terrible things Saddam Hussein did, and there were a number of them. But one of the things you have to consider when you have an authoritarian dictator like that is they do establish and maintain control of their country. And when you remove that control, particularly in a country in which you have Shiites and Sunnis who carry decades of hatred with one another, you realize that you've created a big shitstorm and you're sitting in the middle of it. The U.S. finds itself with the inability to control Iraq, or even the capital city of Baghdad, as it spirals into the abyss of religious civil war, taking the lives of a lot of American troops and Iraqi people with it in the process. It takes a massive troop surge to effectively quell that civil war and to have any kind of semblance of control of the nation of Iraq, but that is achieved at, again, the cost of a lot of loss of life across the board. But with that, the Obama administration then has to ask the question, when and how do we pull our troops out? Remember how we got here? My pivot after we did collapse of the Soviet Union, we looked at the first Persian Gulf War, first Iraq War, and I said, hey, but the presence of American troops in the Middle East is a problem. American troops are like a lightning rod for radical fundamentalists from all over the Muslim world, not just in Iraq itself, to come in order specifically to kill American troops. They're like bait or a magnet for radicals. And so you cannot leave them there in perpetuity. You would eventually have to have an Iraqi government that could stand on its own, so you could remove American troops, which is what the Obama administration attempts to do. Only the timing, in retrospect, proved to be really, really bad. And it turns out that the Iraqi security forces were not quite up to the challenges that they were about to face. Number one, this is around about the same time as a series of uprisings against authoritarian rule in the Muslim world was occurring, the so-called Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a series of, again, uprisings against authoritarian rulers, dictatorships in the Muslim world. This is actually a term they borrowed from the Cold War when there was like the Prague Spring uprising against the communist government in Czechoslovakia. And we thought this was a great thing. Hey, if people in Tunisia or Egypt or Syria don't want to be ruled over by dictators anymore, they should rise up and we should support these liberal democratic freedom movements. Except when they lead to chaos, or in the case of Syria, where they lead that dictator to unleash a brutal campaign of repression and murder willingly of your own civilians. At precisely the same time that one of the fundamentalist, violent, radical veterans of America's war in Iraq decides to resurrect the army, more or less, that he had fielded against America during that war, to take advantage of the ineptitude of the Iraqi security forces in northern Iraq and the vacuum of control and the chaos of Syria's civil war, to create a new Islamic caliphate, or the Islamic State. to bring back the idea that the entirety of the Muslim world there could be ruled over by one caliph, or defender of the faith, as it had been in Ottoman times or Abbasid or Umayyad times. And to, of course, drive any and all Westerners out as violently as possible. And ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, whatever you want to call it, as they take more and more territory in the north of Iraq and the north of Syria, they come to control areas with vast oil wealth that they sell, and they buy weapons. They become more and more and more powerful. Here's Syria, here's Iraq. ISIS eventually controls an area like this large, including a number of large cities in north and central Iraq, like Mosul. I mean, they become a grave threat to the Iraqi government. They threatened Baghdad even at one point. They're enough of a threat to literally everybody else that even people like the US and Russia, who at that time were back to not being very much friends with one another, have to set aside their differences, and everyone has to admit there has to be a combined, asserted effort of all of us to combat ISIS, which, by the way, outdoes the Taliban in their brutality in the areas that come under their control. Throwing homosexuals off of rooftops, summary executions of anyone that does not do precisely as they say, followed their strict, almost medieval, you might say, version of Sharia law. Along the way, some of their members who are very tech and internet savvy decide to videotape brutal executions. This is something that these people are the descendants, if you will, the former followers of a guy named Zarqawi in Iraq that America has killed, but they carry on. Zarqawi had pioneered the idea that you could shock and really terrify people by carrying out these brutal murders, like beheading American journalists on camera and then putting that on the internet. And he does that several times. It's horrifying. That's the kind of shit that these guys continue to do. Or putting a guy in a cage, covering him in gasoline, setting him on fire on video, putting that on the internet. This is the kind of thing that ISIS does. That at least underscores the idea that kind of inhuman brutality should be, something that everyone would want to stop. Fortunately, within the last, I would say, the latter years of the Obama administration, ISIS's territory had been rolled back. They have not as yet been totally eliminated. In fact, where you have seen ISIS pop up in subsequent years is that they have rogue people who have found them on the internet and followed their ideology and decide to go to just drive a truck out into a crowd of people or some shit like that. And so again, it's hard to kill an idea or an ideology, but America and others do at least roll back the territory that ISIS controls to the point at about the time the Trump administration comes in office, they didn't have any territory left. Questions about any of that? What do we got left? 5 minutes? All right. Well, then I'll just kind of blaze through this, and I'll try not to ask anything about this. It's too detailed. I just wanted to show that there have been economic developments in the last quarter century or so, whereas if you could rewind back to where this lecture started and the collapse of the Soviet Union and America as the world's superpower militarily and economically. Well, developments of the last 25 years have shown us that that's maybe not as true as we once thought. Economically speaking, you could look at the rise of East Asian nations. Now, the rise of Japan was very much intentional. After World War II, America decided that you couldn't repeat the mistakes of the First World War and punish your defeated enemies. Sure, you would remove those people from power who were in power, but you would then establish a friendly regime and build them up economically. So the rise of Japan in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s is very much intentional. What follows is the rise of the so-called Asian tigers, other East Asian nations that themselves followed the Japanese model, especially in building cars and electronics that they could then sell in the West. If I had my notes, I'd rattle off a whole list of Japanese and Korean corporations. So what were the Asian tigers? South Korea, Hong Kong, which was at the time controlled by the British, Singapore. Eventually there would be others, the little tigers that even in more recent years have risen up economically, even some that are controlled by communist regimes, Vietnam, which follows the Chinese model. By the way, China, and you know this from the previous lecture, has established itself as the #2 economy in the world, perhaps even poised to overtake the United States at some point. Meanwhile, oil continues, at least for now, to generate profound wealth for a small group of individuals in nations like, of course, Saudi Arabia, but also small nations like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Some of the most insane real estate developments and skyscrapers in the world are in places like Dubai in the UAE. The tallest building on earth is in Dubai, the Burj Khalifa right here. Not enough arable land to build nice resorts. Build an island in the sea in the shape of a palm tree. Why not? You got money. The idea for the leadership of the UAE and perhaps of Qatar to a lesser extent is that the oil is not going to last forever, finite resource, and so they want to reorient themselves as a center of elite tourism and of finance and that kind of thing. Finally, the EU, if you measured it as a singular economic unit, would be up there with the US and China among the top economies in the world. The European Union has always at heart been an economic union. That's how it begins in the decades following World War II. There's a series of more or less trade pacts between the nations of Europe. Initially only the nations of Western Europe, but eventually after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, including most of those nations as well. All the nations in any shade of blue, with one obvious exception now, are members of the European Union, but only the ones in dark blue are members of the Eurozone. If you are in the Eurozone, you're not just a member of the European Union, but your currency is the euro. I was in Ireland in 1999 when they had just changed over to the euro. No longer could you use the Irish pound anymore. It was actually in a transitional period where you could use either, but eventually the franc in France would be replaced by the euro. The Deutsche Mark in Germany would be phased out for the euro, and so on. So some of these countries that are members of the European Union do not use the euro. Does that make sense? At the heart of the EU are certain supranational institutions. There is a European Parliament, so people in any EU member nation get to vote for members of their own government, of course, but they get to vote for members to go sit in the European Parliament as well. There is a European executive. So there's essentially a president of the EU. There's also a council of the heads of state of all the EU member nations. And then there's a European Central Bank, which is extremely powerful. The two key elements beyond those supranational institutions, though, are the single market and the Schengen zone. Single market means if you were a part of the European Union single market, that's a free trade zone, essentially. No tariff barriers. And that's an incredible benefit for member nations in that single market zone. If you're part of the Schengen zone, free movement of people. So free movement of goods in the single market, free movement of people in the Schengen zone. meaning there are not border controls and customs at the borders of these nations. You can travel freely through them, more or less as the states of the United States. Now, as part of the idea of the principle of free movement of people, though, things like immigration are areas where the European Parliament may have more say-so in nations' policies than those nations' own parliaments. At a time where there are, thousands of people fleeing places like Syria and Yemen because they don't want to face the choice of being murdered by some rebel group or murdered by their own government, or accidentally murdered by American or Russian troops in an airstrike that went wrong. And so these human beings are fleeing that chaos for some semblance of peace. And they're seeing the doors of these European nations slammed in their face. And they're seeing nations like Britain that are so afraid of being overrun by outsiders. And so angry that they don't have full control of their own immigration policy that they're willing to leave the European Union over it. That and claiming that they contribute more to Europe's economy despite not being a member of the Eurozone. Britain never joined the Eurozone, maintained the use of the British pound. But they claim, other nations don't carry their fair weight. We're losing money. We're being overrun by immigrants. We're leaving. So the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, a process which is, as we speak, ongoing. The vote was close, I will tell you. A lot of people, especially in Scotland and Northern Ireland, didn't want to leave the European Union. So now becomes the question of, will Scotland again seek independence from the United Kingdom? Will there be another referendum? What do you do with an Ireland now where the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is not just one between the UK and the Republic, that's a border between European Union and not European Union now. And I can tell you, knowing something about Irish history, nobody in Ireland wants to see the return of a hard border between the 6 counties of the north and the Republic. So these are all things to consider moving forward. Sorry I went over a few minutes. Questions? All right.